Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources and really try to extract the core insights, helping you get genuinely well-informed. Today, we're jumping into something I find truly fascinating. A real paradox, actually. It might make you, scratch your head a bit. The Apostle Paul, prolific traveler, writer of these world-changing letters, and he also worked a day job, making tents of all things. Quite a puzzle, isn't it? I mean, here's this guy establishing churches all over the place, writing incredible theology, and yet there he is doing manual labor. So the big question that kicked off this deep dive is why? Why did Paul, who traveled so much preaching and teaching, also earn money this way? And maybe even more pointedly, when Paul himself famously boasted about ministering free of charge, why do relatively few ministers seem to follow that exact model today?
It's a great question, and yeah, it definitely tends to provoke some, shall we say, simplistic reactions sometimes. You hear the common refrains, right? Oh, pastors are greedy, or they shouldn't get a paycheck at all. But our goal today, our mission, is really to get past those easy answers. We want to explore the nuances. We're aiming for a balanced, intellectually honest look at ministry and money back in the New Testament, especially through Paul's eyes and actions.
Okay, so let's start right where the paradox begins, with Paul's own words. Because in 1 Corinthians 9, he actually seems to argue for his right to get support. What's he doing there?
That's exactly right. It's such a key passage. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 11, he asks point blank, "If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you?" So he's absolutely establishing his right to be supported. That's the baseline, even if, as we'll see, he often chose not to exercise that right in Corinth. And then he builds this case using examples people would immediately understand. He talks about soldiers, farmers, shepherds, people who get compensated for their work. He even mentions, oxen not being muzzled while they're working. That's verses 7 through 10. Plus, he points out that temple workers get their food from the temple. It's a known principle. And then the clincher in verse 14, "The Lord commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel." A direct command. And you have to picture Corinth. This wasn't some backwater village. It was a massive trade center, a travel crossroads. People have called it the New York, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas of the ancient world. Seriously. Commerce, the Isthmian Games, it was bustling. And this church Paul founded around AD 50. It was pretty young when he wrote this, maybe only 5 years old or so. And just to clarify, when he says material harvest, we're talking basic needs. Food, drink, not, a life of luxury.
Okay, that really paints a picture of Paul clearly outlining his rights. But that phrase, "the Lord has commanded," where exactly did that command originate?
That's Paul connecting the dots directly back to Jesus himself. His words, his example. Think about Luke chapter 10. Jesus sends out the 72 disciples and tells them, "Stay there, eating and drinking whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages." Clear instruction. And similarly, in Matthew 10, he tells the 12, "Don't take gold or silver because the laborer deserves his food." So these disciples, they're called workers, and their payment, their wages, the Greek is misthos. It's directly linked to basics: lodging, food, drink. And if you zoom out a bit, Jesus himself modeled this. He accepted material support. Luke 8 mentions women who were helping to support them out of their own means. And John 12 even talks about Judas carrying a money bag, which implies they received donations. I mean, think about that. The Lord of the universe received financial help.
Wow, okay, so we've got these broad principles for gospel workers. But what about specific instructions for, say, leaders within a local church, elders, for instance?
Yeah, Paul gets specific on that too. In 1 Timothy 5, verses 17 and 18, he writes, "The elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching." And again, he backs it up with those familiar quotes, "Do not muzzle an ox, and the worker deserves his wages." Now that term double honor, it almost certainly includes both respect and financial support. We can kind of infer that because Paul uses the same Greek word for honor just a bit earlier in the same chapter, talking about financial help for widows. So the context points that way. It's also worth remembering, elder and overseer were likely interchangeable terms then. And churches usually had several elders, not just one main pastor like we often see today. But here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit surprising for some. Even with this clear basis for support, getting a full-time salary, that was probably pretty rare for early church leaders. Why? Well, there were traditional Jewish views against getting paid for teaching scripture. And the Roman authorities. They were often suspicious of people who didn't have a visible trade. Paul himself, talking to the elders from Ephesus in Acts 20, he says, "These hands of mine have supplied my own needs." That strongly suggests they weren't all expecting full-time paychecks.
That's a really important piece of historical context. It changes the picture quite a bit. So the foundation for support is there, but maybe not in the way we automatically assume today. What about the other side then? The responsibility of the people actually receiving the teaching.
Good question. Paul addresses that in Galatians 6, verse 6. It's pretty direct. The one who receives instruction in the word should share all good things with their instructor. All good things. That's broad, but yeah, it definitely includes material stuff, food, shelter, money, especially since the instructor is giving up time they could be using to earn a living elsewhere. It ties right into what Paul says just before that in verse 2 about carrying each other's burdens. Sharing financial burdens seems to be part of that. And what's fascinating is how he contrasts that right after in verse 5, saying, each one should carry their own load. The words are different in Greek. A burden is like a heavyweight, a real hardship you might need help with. A load is more like your personal backpack of responsibilities. So we're responsible for ourselves, yes, but we're also called to help share the heavy burdens of others, including supporting those who teach.
Okay, so the evidence piles up. Ministers should be supported. But then we hit the big paradox. Paul, the guy arguing for this, right, often turned down support himself, especially in places like Corinth. How do we square that circle, right? Because it's easy to just focus on Paul saying no to payment sometimes. But that's not the whole story, is it? He actually did accept help quite often.
Exactly. That's so important to grasp. He was crystal clear about his rights, but his practice was way more flexible than just a blanket no-pay policy. Take the Philippians, for example. He explicitly says in Philippians 4, they sent him help repeatedly to take care of my needs. And that wasn't just when he was in prison in Rome later on. It was even earlier when he was ministering in Thessalonica. He calls their contributions gifts, a fragrant offering, high praise. We also see it in 2 Corinthians 11. Paul mentions that when he was in Corinth and needed things, brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. This meant he didn't have to burden the Corinthians financially at that time. And yeah, those Macedonian brothers, almost certainly the Philippians again. And then you've got guys from Corinth itself, Stephanas, Fortunatus, Achaicus, who came to him later in Ephesus and, as 1 Corinthians 16 puts it, supplied what was lacking. And don't forget Phoebe. In Romans 16, he calls her a benefactor of many people, including me. He's not hiding the fact that he received help.
And it wasn't just money or supplies, right? Hospitality was a big one, too. He needed places to stay.
Absolutely. Loads of examples. Gaius hosted him in Corinth, maybe the same Gaius Paul baptized. Priscilla and Aquila, fellow tent makers, he stayed and worked with them in Corinth, Acts 18 says. In Philippi, Lydia basically insisted. She persuaded Paul and his team to stay at her house. That's in Acts 16. And up in Thessalonica, remember Jason, Paul and Silas lodged at his home, which actually got Jason into trouble later. That's Acts 17.
And he even looked ahead, expecting help for future travel plans. He wasn't shy about that either.
Not at all. He clearly tells the Romans he hopes they'll assist me on my journey to Spain. That's Romans 15. He expected the Corinthians to help him on his way to Judea too, mentioned in both 1 and 2 Corinthians. That phrase, help me on my journey, it was almost like technical jargon back then for missionary support. Food, money, finding passage, that kind of thing. What's really interesting here is you start to see a pattern. Paul's working principle kind of looks like this. I won't take money from you for serving you, but you absolutely can help me serve others. And it makes sense, right? He needed help with travel costs because, well, you can't exactly make tents while you're walking or on a boat. And remember Philemon. Paul straight up asks him to get a guest room ready, so he was definitely open to receiving lodging and support for his ongoing mission.
Okay, so Paul clearly believed in the right to support, accepted it often, even expected it for travel. Which brings us right back to the core tension. Why? Why did he make such a point of refusing it from the Corinthians specifically? This is where it gets really juicy. Yeah, this clearly wasn't just some random decision Paul made on a whim in Corinth. It sounds like a very deliberate strategy with multiple layers. So what were those layers? Why did he take this unique path there?
You're right. It was definitely complex. The sources we looked at pull out at least 7 distinct but overlapping reasons. And together, they give us a really rich understanding of his thinking. Reason number 1 may be the bedrock. Christ's example. Paul flat out says in 1 Corinthians 9.1 that he chose not to use his right to pay. Why? Because he was just captivated by Jesus' own sacrifice. He talks about making himself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. That's verse 19. And he explicitly tells them later, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. That's 1 Corinthians 11.1. Think about it. Christ had every right to stay in heavenly glory, but he became poor for our sake. Paul saw that, and he mirrored it by setting aside his rights. Now, he wasn't ignoring what Jesus said about the workers' wages. He saw it as a right, yes, but a right he was free to refuse, just like Christ was free to lay aside his divine privileges. And there's a key difference, too. Jesus sent his disciples on shorter trips within Israel. Paul was on a long-haul mission, planting churches deep in the pagan Hellenistic world. He couldn't just show up and demand support in the same way.
So it's deeply theological, rooted in imitating Christ's self-emptying. Okay, what's the second reason?
Reason 2 was all about gospel growth and avoiding obstacles. Paul says it starkly in 1 Corinthians 9:12. He put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. That word hinder, it literally means like cutting into a road, breaking it up so no one can pass. Powerful image. He worried that if he took money in Corinth, people might just dismiss him as another traveling philosopher or lecturer out to make a buck. That would shut doors, especially to the poor. It could also make people suspicious, thinking maybe the wealthy patrons were influencing his message, that he was bought. So by refusing payment, especially from the rich, and working with his hands, he identified with the weak, the lower classes. He became weak for the weak, as he says later in chapter 9. His absolute focus was the gospel moving forward. Any right that might block that road, he'd gladly set it aside. Reason 3. Undercutting the super apostles. Paul mentions these rivals, these super apostles in 2 Corinthians. He says he's not inferior to them at all. These guys were likely impressive speakers, maybe kind of flashy, and they were taking money from the Corinthians. Now remember, Corinth was a very status-conscious city, lots of newly rich people, wealth often equaled status. A preacher who worked a manual job and didn't take fees, he'd probably look low status to them. But Paul deliberately used this. He says in the 2 Corinthians 11:12, his goal was to cut the ground from under those who want an opportunity to be considered equal with us in the things they boast about. He implies these rivals were peddling the word of God for profit, maybe watering down the message to keep the cash flowing. Paul, by contrast, offered the powerful gospel free of charge. He desperately wanted to avoid any hint of greed. Remember what he told the Ephesian elders? I have not coveted anyone's silver or gold or clothing. These hands of mine have supplied my own needs. Same principle.
Wow, that's some serious strategic thinking. It wasn't just about personal piety. It was about outmaneuvering opponents and protecting the gospel's integrity in a very specific, challenging context.
Yep.
Okay, what else?
Reason 4 is simpler, but still important. Being no burden. He mentions this specifically regarding Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians 2 and 2 Thessalonians 3. He and his team worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone. That implies some serious hard work during the week, outside of his Sabbath teaching. And he says in 2 Corinthians 11:9, he followed the same policy in Corinth, refusing to be a burden to them, even while, interestingly, accepting help from the Macedonians, the Philippians, at that very time. His focus was on not burdening the specific community he was currently serving in. Reason 5 is quite personal, joy. Paul actually says in 1 Corinthians 9:18 that preaching the gospel free of charge was his reward, his pay. He genuinely found pleasure, deep satisfaction in being able to offer God's incredibly free grace, freely, without any financial strings attached. Number 6, he wanted to be a model of diligence. He tells the Thessalonians his hard work was a model for you to imitate. This was important because there seemed to be some issues with idleness in the Thessalonian church. He lays down that rule. The one who is unwilling to work shall not eat. And he didn't just say it, he lived it, he modeled it. Same thing with the Ephesian elders in Acts 20. He points to his own hard work as their example, explicitly contrasting it with coveting wealth.
That's powerful. Leading by example, literally with sweat on his brow.
Oh.
Okay, so that connects to the final reason then.
Exactly. Reason 7 is closely related. Being a model of generosity. In that same speech to the Ephesian elders, Acts 20:35, he says he worked hard to help the weak. His goal wasn't just to avoid taking money for himself, it was actually to earn money so he could give it away, to personally provide for the poor. We know he was heavily involved in collecting funds for the impoverished church in Jerusalem. This wasn't just talk, he practiced active generosity himself. So modeling diligence and modeling generosity went hand in hand. He showed them, by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak.
Okay, so putting it all together, Christ's example, avoiding obstacles, undercutting rivals, not being a burden, the sheer joy of it, modeling diligence, modeling generosity, it paints an incredibly rich picture. This wasn't just Paul being difficult. It was a deeply thought-out, multi-layered strategy rooted in his core convictions and tailored to the specific challenges he faced. But what does all this mean for us? We're living thousands of years later in a totally different world. How do we apply this?
Yeah, before we just leap to conclusions about how pastors should or shouldn't be paid today, we really need to hit pause and acknowledge how different Paul's world was from ours. It's not exactly apples to apples.
That's absolutely critical, a huge caveat. First off, Paul never made his own practice a universal rule. He didn't command everyone else to refuse support. Remember, he acknowledged other apostles like Peter and James did receive support, and he didn't criticize them for it. His boast in 1 Corinthians 9 was about his choice, his freedom, not a law for everyone. Second, just the scale and context are vastly different. Christianity back then was a tiny, often suspect, minority religion. Believers met in small house churches. We're talking maybe 30, 50 people max. Even in a big city like Corinth, the total number of Christians was probably only 150 to 200 when Paul wrote. Compare that to many congregations today. Third, think about scripture study. Paul was fluent in the original languages, Hebrew, Greek. He lived in that ancient world. He didn't need decades of academic study to understand the context because it was his context. Today, developing a deep scholarly understanding requires immense time, specialized training, access to resources, all of which has financial implications. It often means forgoing years of earning potential in other fields. Fourth, the New Testament talks about support in general terms, wages, food, lodging. But it doesn't lay out anything like modern employment contracts or detailed salary structures. It's a much later development. Fifth, we need to remember Paul wasn't a lone wolf. He constantly worked with partners Barnabas, Silas, Timothy, Aquila, and Priscilla. He received support from churches, even while refusing it in others. He wasn't completely self-funded all the time. And finally, Paul had a unique calling as the apostle to the Gentiles. He was a pioneer, an itinerant church planter breaking new ground. His specific approach was shaped by that unique foundational role. So yeah, all these differences mean we can't just say, okay, everyone should do exactly what Paul did in Corinth. It's just not that simple.
Those are really important points. They highlight the dangers of just lifting Paul's practice out of its context. So given all that, how do we draw meaningful application for today? What principles can we take away, even if the exact practice looks different?
Great question. Even with the caveats, Paul's example is packed with powerful principles. First and foremost, prioritize gospel advance. Everything Paul did was subservient to that one goal, getting the good news out unhindered. That should be our driving priority too, whatever our role. Second, challenge any entitlement mentality. Paul constantly talks about laying down his rights for the sake of others and the gospel. That flies in the face of so much modern culture, which is often about demanding our rights. And this hits home for ministry leaders today, right? It forces some tough questions. Are you in ministry primarily for the paycheck? Would you still serve if the pay wasn't there? Is your compensation level potentially becoming a burden or even a stumbling block? How does it affect your ability to minister effectively to everyone? It reminds me of that quote from Richard Hayes, asking if some salaried ministers have become kind of domesticated by patronage, too dependent on wealthy donors, maybe hesitant to preach challenging truths. That's a provocative thought. And Paul's answer. Look at Jesus. Look at his willingness to give up everything. Third principle, don't be lazy. Paul was the opposite of lazy. He worked tirelessly, both in ministry and often at his trade. This is so important, especially for those in paid ministry, to counteract that unfair stereotype, that pastors only work one day a week. Maybe simple things like being visible, working hard, like studying in a public library sometimes can help model that diligence. Fourth, don't embrace a false self-sufficiency. Yes, Paul worked hard, but he wasn't too proud to accept help. He needed it. Travel was expensive, prison was debilitating, persecution took its toll. Letter writing cost a fortune. Scholars estimate Romans might have cost the equivalent of over $2,000 just for materials and scribe fees back then. He openly thanked his supporters. So we shouldn't hide behind a kind of hyper-spiritual, God will provide attitude that refuses legitimate help out of pride. We need each other. Reciprocity is healthy. Fifth, don't be greedy. Paul constantly warned against the love of money, especially for leaders. If someone is compensated for ministry, contentment is key. Aiming for an average lifestyle within the community being served, avoiding extravagance that could cause pride or hinder the gospel. Sixth, don't despise ordinary work. Paul was an apostle and a leather worker. He rubbed shoulders with everyday people in the marketplace. It's a powerful reminder that secular jobs are valuable, sacred callings too. Ministry isn't the only important work. Seventh, recognize there's no single one-size-fits-all model for ministry. Paul's example provides a vital alternative, especially in contexts where full-time paid ministry just isn't feasible. Think poorer nations or restricted access countries. Education is crucial, yes, but how people get that education and how they structure their ministry can vary widely. Developing other skills, maybe even a trait like Paul, can be incredibly wise. And it comes back to this. There's no absolute law here. Paul didn't force Peter or others to adopt his specific strategy of refusing pay in Corinth. There's freedom and flexibility. And one last one, maybe number 8. Be careful how you teach about giving. Paul encouraged generosity, yes, but never through coercion or guilt. No commanding tithes. It was always about cheerful giving, deciding in your own heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, as he says in 2 Corinthians 9.
That's a really helpful breakdown.
So it seems Paul's life isn't meant to be a rigid blueprint, maybe more like a compass, offering guiding principles for navigating this tricky intersection of faith, work, and money.
Exactly. And it is tricky. It's complex, sensitive, always has been. You look through church history and sadly you see financial abuses popping up again and again, selling indulgences way back when, the prosperity gospel stuff today. Add to that the fact that our modern terms like pastor or salary don't have perfect one-to-one equivalents back then.
Yeah, it definitely feels like walking a theological tightrope sometimes.
Which is why, as you said earlier, we absolutely shouldn't take Paul's very specific practice in places like Corinth and make it a hard and fast rule for everyone, everywhere, all the time. The overall biblical principle seems clear. Those who dedicate their time to teaching and preaching do deserve that material harvest, those all good things, in return for their labor. Right, that general principle stands. However, Paul's model, especially refusing payment when first entering a new field, like he did during that year and a half in Corinth, that clearly had strategic advantages for the gospel's advance. So, while compensation is generally appropriate, it doesn't automatically mean a full-time salary as we know it. That concept just wasn't really there in the first century. Avoiding greed, avoiding lavish lifestyles, that's non-negotiable for leaders. And the freedom remains. Leaders can always choose to forego their right to compensation, like Paul did. But crucially, they should also remain open to receiving help and support, because as we saw with Paul, true self-sufficiency isn't the biblical model either.
It really is remarkable how Paul's choices navigated so many potential pitfalls we still see today, isn't it? Laziness, being a financial drain, looking down on manual work, false self-sufficiency, entitlement, greed. He seemed to sidestep them all.
He really did. And it leaves you with a pretty powerful thought to chew on, doesn't it? Just imagine. How different might things look today? How different might church history have been if Christian leaders throughout the centuries had managed to consistently avoid those same dangers? Something to think about.